Hello and welcome to this section of CSS Foundations. So we'll start with Introduction to CSS. Let's look at the Markdown. Let's copy this into my Markdown editor on Stack Edit. And we are ready to start. So I also have my editor open. I can run my HTML, CSS, I can paste them here. And I'll be able to see it on the right half of my screen. So let's look at the Markdown. In the previous lesson, we learned, let's go there. You learned how to write the HTML that determines how a web page is structured. The next step is to make that structure look good with some style, which is exactly what CSS is for. In the next few lessons, we are going to focus on what we believe are some foundational CSS concepts, things that everyone should know from the beginning, whether they are just starting out or simply need a refresher. So the next step, so what is the summary? Next step is to make that structure look good with some style, which is exactly what CSS is for. So let's get rid of this part. Our lesson overview: add styles to HTML with CSS. Understand how to use class and ID attributes. So there is something called class and something called ID. There are attributes. We'll know more about this. Add styles to specific elements using the correct selectors. So we have to use the correct selectors. Basic syntax. At the most basic level, CSS is made up of various rules. These rules are made up of selector, more on this in a bit, and a semicolon separated list of declarations, with each of these declarations being made up of a property value pair. So we have a selector div dot bold hyphen text. So this is the selector, bold hyphen text. And then inside our parenthesis, we have a property, which is font weight, font hyphen weight in this example, and a value, which is 700 in this case. Note, a div is one of the basic HTML elements. It is simply an empty container. In general, it is best to use other tags such as h1 or p for content in your project. But as we learn more about CSS, you'll find that there are many cases where the thing you need is just a container for other elements. Many of our exercises use plain divs for simplicity. Later, lessons will go into much more depth and when it is appropriate to use various HTML elements. Selectors. Selectors simply refer to the HTML elements to which CSS rules apply. They are what is actually being selected for each rule. The following subsections don't cover every selector available, but they are by far the most common and the ones you should get comfortable using first. Universal selector. The universal selector will select elements of any type, hence the name universal. And the syntax for it is a simple asterisk. In the example below, every element would have the color purple style applied to it. So star color purple. So if we declare this in our styles, all the elements will get the color purple. Type selectors. A type selector or element selector will select all elements of the given element type, and the syntax is just the name of the element. So we have some code. We'll copy this, paste it into our index.html. So we have our index.html in the body. I paste it there so I can see the result here. Let me bloat this up to 200%. Okay, looks good. So this is how, and we can also use our control KF. So now it's properly indented. Our HTML looks good. So now let's look at the style. So style says color equal to white. Now color white will turn everything to white. Let me get my style tag in here. So let me have my style tag and I paste my div. So again, I will indent them properly. And if it's done properly, the div, so the first two divs and the last div, they will lose the color. So instead of white, let me give it a different color. Then we can actually see it, because currently we can't see it. We have to highlight. If we highlight, okay, this is one nifty trick. So if you can't see anything on the page, just select Ctrl A. So it will select everything on the page, and everything that is white will also become visible. So now I have put the color red on all the three divs that are invisible right now. Let me refresh. So yes, so those three will turn up again. Now we have three colors, three of them in red. Here all three divs would be selected while the P element wouldn't be. P element remains black as you saw. Class selectors. Class selectors will select all elements with the given class, which is just an attribute you place on an HTML element. Here's how we add a class to an HTML tag and select it in CSS. So how do you do it? Div class alert text, and then please agree to our terms and service, this content, text content. So let me select that, all of that, and paste it at the bottom. So I have that. Let's see how it looks. So it's red as well because it's coming from this div. It's inside a div, so it gets that color. But now we'll also add another style. What is that style? Alert text color red. So because the previous one is also red, this will have this will conflict with that. So let me change this to another color. Let's say green. That's good. And let me indent them properly again. Control K F. So every time in VS Code, you do Control K and F to indent the HTML properly. Let's refresh. So everything is green coming from this div, and the alert text class, because of that, the last line is in red. So that's how this class selector is working and modifying the div. Note the syntax for class selectors: a period immediately followed by case sensitive value of class attribute. So these are case sensitive. If you have a capital T or a capital A, it will not, those styles will not be implemented. Let's show you an example. So if this has a capital A, let me put this capital. If I refresh, everything will become green. So it is case sensitive. Your class names and ID names are case sensitive in CSS. Classes aren't required to be specific to a particular element, so you can use the same class on as many elements as you want. So you can use the classes on multiple elements, whereas for ID, it has to be only on one element. You can also put on two elements, but it will always, CSS will always identify the first as the only ID. Another thing you can do with the class attribute is to add multiple classes to a single element as a space separated list, such as class equal to, and then within quotes you have alert text space severe alert. While white space is used to separate class names like this, you should never use spaces for multi-worded names and should use a hyphen instead. So if you put a space over here, severe, and then space and alert, this will become three different classes: alert text, space severe, and space alert. So you have to always use a hyphen when you want multi-word names. Let's look at ID selectors. ID selectors are similar to class selectors. They select an element with the given ID, which is another attribute you place on an HTML element. The major difference between classes and IDs is that an element can only have one ID. It cannot be repeated on a single page and should not contain any white space. So we have another example: div ID, title, my awesome 90s page. So let's put this in our code. Goes after this div. So let's put in there. If I refresh, it shows up, it's green because the previous one was green. So let's change it back to the default color. So we can have it as black or we can have it as auto. So what are the options we have in color? Do we have auto option? I think it will just fail, and so it will get we'll get the default black color. And in styles, we will have a background color of red on the title. So let's add that here. Let's indent everything back. So our background color is there. Let's refresh, and yeah, so the last div, which has the ID title, that is getting the selector background color, which is red. You can also use just background, so it will also have the same effect. So it is background and background color are just aliases. So if you refresh, the same result. For IDs, instead of a period, use a hashtag immediately followed by the case sensitive value of the ID attribute. A common pitfall is people overusing the ID attribute when they don't necessarily need to and when classes will suffice. While there are cases where using an ID makes sense or is needed, such as taking advantage of specificity or having links redirect to a section of the current page, you should use IDs sparingly if at all. So you should use sparingly at all. This I think is an important line. So let me highlight that up. I will use 2 underscores and 2 underscores. So everything becomes highlighted. You should use IDs sparingly if at all. The grouping selector. What if you have two groups of elements that share some of their styles and declarations? So you can think of this. You can already get done instinctively that you can reduce your code by writing this down commonly. So how do we do this? here is an example, dot red. So what is dot? Dot is a class. So we know this is a class called red. Color is white, background color black, default. And then several unique declarations. And then there is a class unread, dot unread. And it also has the color white and background color black. And other unique declarations. Both our read and unread selectors share the color white and background color black declarations, but otherwise having several of their unique declarations. To cut down on the repetition, we can group these two selectors together as a comma separated list. So we have dot read, comma, dot unread, just use a comma, and then you can add multiple classes. And then you have the common style, so color white and background color black. So you have read and you have unread. Both of the examples above, with and without grouping, will have the same result. But the second example reduces the repetition of declarations and makes it easier to edit either the color or the background color for both classes at once. So how do we see this in our example? So in our example, we have a star title and we also have a class. So let's group them into one dot alert text and hash title. Now let's give them some common styles. What is the common style you can give? We already have used color and background. So maybe we can use a font size. So let me increase the font size. So let me use a 20 pixels. So you see these two, just these two, last two, title and alert text. Let's make this bigger so that it's even more distinct. So I'm using a 30px. And you can see these two, it's only applying on the alert text class and the idle class. So the font size becomes big, rest of them remain the same. So this is how you can use common styles on a bunch of selectors. Chaining selectors. Another way to use selectors is to chain them as a list without any separation. Let's say we had the following HTML. So here we have some HTML. Let's copy this into our editor. At the end of everything, at the end, just before the body tag. So there I have it. Let me refresh. So now what I have is the latest post, and this is where preview for a post might go. So we have two p tags inside one div tag. Okay, so let's prettify them. Let's align them up. So div and some things inside those div. Looking good. We have two elements with a subsection class, so first and second. So this div and p both share this subsection class that have some sort of unique styles. But what if we only want them to apply a separate rule to the element that also has a header as a second class? Well, we could chain both the class selectors together in our CSS like so. So subsection, and we are chaining header. So there is no space between them. So between the two classes, there is no space. They are chained to each other. So let's take that part of the styles. Let's apply this here. So now there's too much of red. We might have to use a different color. Let's use a different color here. So with that, so subsection header is blue. So just only, even though this is subsection, this second p tag is also subsection, but you can only, the selectors will only select those elements which have both the subsection class and the header class. Those only will turn blue. So only the header turns blue. Clear? What subsection.header does is it selects any element that has both the subsection and header classes. Notice how there isn't any space between the subsection. So we have to highlight this thing. There isn't, let me highlight this in my notes. There isn't any space. There isn't any space. So that's how I highlight. There isn't any space between the subsection and the .header class selectors. This syntax basically works for chaining any combination of selectors, except for chaining more than one type of selectors, one type selector. This can also be used to chain a class and an ID as shown below. So here you can see another example. So in this case, they have just changed the interior of that. So I will just take the interior part, put it in my editor. So it is just in the inside, have the same thing. Let's refresh. So the subsection header remains the same. You can take the two elements above and combine them with the following. So what they're doing now. So let me overwrite the previous style we had. So we had a red over there and a blue over there. Prettify indent proper, make the indent. And if I refresh, so the latest post, which is the subsection header, it becomes red as then color red. And the subsection hashtag preview, so it has both subsection class and the ID preview, that will become blue. So this one becomes blue, this one doesn't become blue. So now you know how chaining works. In general, you can't chain more than one type selector, since an element can't be two different types at once. For example, chaining two type selectors like div and p would give us the selector div p, which wouldn't work since the selectors would try to find a literal div p. So div, using this kind of element, like chaining two elements, will not work. Find a literal div p element which doesn't exist, at least in HTML. Descendant combinator. Combinators allow us to combine multiple selectors differently than either grouping or chaining them, as they show a relationship between the selectors. There are 4 types of combinators in total, but for right now, we are going to only show you the descendant combinator. So currently, we are going to look at one of those, which is represented in CSS by a single space between selectors. A descendant combinator will only cause elements that match the last selector to be selected if they also have an ancestor, a parent or a grandparent, etc. So anything that is above the chain that matches the previous selector. So something like dot ancestor space. So the space is very vital. Dot child. If you don't give the space, it will look for both the classes on the same element. But we don't want to do that. We want a descendant here. So this space is vital. Keep this in mind. This space is very vital. Would select an element with the class child if it has an ancestor with the class ancestor. Another way to think of it is child will only be selected if it is nested inside of ancestor, no matter how deep. So it can be like 10 levels deep, but still it would qualify. Take a look at the example below and see if you can tell which elements would be selected based on the CSS rule provided. So let's look at the example. We have a ancestor div, and then inside there is a contents div, and then one more level inside is a contents div, and there is some content C inside that. And at the end, outside this ancestor div, there is another div which has a contents class. The style we're going to apply is ancestor and then the combinator and then a contents and some declarations. So what will happen in the above example, the first 2 elements with the contents class B and C would be selected, but the last element wouldn't be. Was your guess correct? So did you guess this correctly? Let's see this by putting in our code. What we have over here in index. So let me select this whole thing. Let's go to our editor. At the end of our editor, so let me separate this by a HR tag so it's easily visible. And if I refresh, so we need to put some contents in here. So this is ancestor and this is contents, and inside of this is more contents. So after saving, so now we can see the contents, and inside this one is also content, the same content. Okay, now the style that they're asking for is, what I remember from there is dot ancestor. So dot ancestor, and here is the space, and then comes a dot. It's a class, right? So it's dot contents s, and then there is some style on this. So let's say color, and let's put a color of green. Saving it. So the contents that you can see, only the 2 contents, only these 2 are turning green. If I put a background color, I think that will be more visible, more contrasting. So let's put a background. So you can see only these 2 contents get the background, but the last one, because it is not nested inside the ancestor class div, the last one will not change its background color. So up till there it's clear how this thing is getting qualified. So last element D wouldn't be, and that is, was your guess correct? So you tell us, were you able to guess correctly? There's really no limit to how many combinators you can add to a rule. So .1 space .2 space .3 space .4 would be totally valid. So it is like one child inside another inside another. This would just select an element that has a class of 4 if it has an ancestor with a class of 3, and if that ancestor has its own ancestor with a class of 2, and so on. So it has to be exactly in this order. If any one of them is missing or is misplaced, then the style will not apply on that child, that last selector, it will not apply. You generally want to avoid trying to select elements that need this level of nesting, as it can get pretty confusing and long, and it can cause issues when it comes to specificity. So you will try to avoid this, and you try to be more specific. So you will try to jump from the top ancestor to the lowest child, and that is one way of writing maintainable CSS code. Properties to get started with. There are some CSS properties that you're going to be using all the time, or at least the very least more often than not. We are going to introduce you to several of these properties, though this is by no means a complete list. Learning the following properties will simply be enough to help you get started. So color and background color, we were already working with this. The color property sets an element's text color. So while the background color sets the background color of an element. I guess we're done here. Yeah. So that was very pretty self-explanatory. The color sets the color of the text, while background is the background. Almost. Both of these properties can accept one or several kinds of values. A common one is a keyword, such as an actual color name like the red or transparent keyword. They also accept hex, RGB, and HSL values, which you may be familiar with if you have ever used a Photoshop program or a site where you customize your profile colors. So how does this RGB or hex colors, how do they look like? So this is an example. A hex example has a hashtag just like your IDs, but in this case it has 6-number alphanumeric. So this is the R part. It's like the R part, the G part, followed by the G part, followed by the B part. And this is how the X number is written. RGB example, here it is like 255, so 0 to 255, the red channel, the blue channel, and the green channel. So RGB and then 0 to 255, 3 of them. So red, green, blue, and accordingly the color will be mixed. In an HSL, it is 15, and then there are 2 percentages. So saturation, and I think this is light. So this is hue, saturation, and L. So there are 3 different parameters based on which the color is decided. Take a quick look at the CSS legal color values to see how, so this one is on W3 Schools, yeah. So this is the W3 Schools article. How you can adjust the opacity of these colors by adding an alpha value. So adding, at the end of it, you can also add another alpha value, which also again varies from 00 to FF in case of hex example, and 0 to 1 in case of the other 2 examples. And based on that, it would be the level of opacity is put on those colors. Let's see an example. Yeah, I think it is a good time to see an example. So here I have put red background on this, my awesome. So let's go to that. Color red, background red. So red is nothing but hash FF 0000. So this is very simple. As you work with this, you will get to know these colors, these well-known colors, and then at the end of it you can select other 2 characters, other 2 alphanumeric characters, which will make it transparent. So it looks like pink, but actually it has become more transparent. And that's how, like, if I make it totally 0, one way of it is, if it is FF, it is completely opaque, so the full red comes in. And if it is 00, then even though it is red, but it is totally transparent. If it is 11, which is like slightly transparent, so you can see a very slight transparent red that you can see, which is highlighting. So that's how the opacity works. Typography basics and text align. Font family can be a single value or a comma separated list of values that determine what font an element uses. Each font will fall into one of the 2 categories, either a font family name like Times New Roman, which is a very popular font. We use quotes due to the white space between the words. So because there are spaces, we have to give it quotes. Or a generic family name like sans serif. Generic family names never use quotes. Instead, they have this hyphens in case of multi-word. If a browser cannot find or does not support the first font in a list, it will use the next one, then the next one, and so on until it finds a supported and valid font. This is why it is best practice to include a list of values for this property, starting with the font you want to be used most and ending with a generic font family as a fallback. Example, font family Times New Roman followed by sans serif. And if none of this suffices, then finally the browser will have another fallback, the browser's own style sheet, and it will go to that font. So generally it is sans serif or serif. These are the two values the browsers choose, and your text will fall back. It will always have a fallback. Font size will, as the property name suggests, set the size of the font. When giving a value to this property, the value should not contain any white spaces. Example, font hyphen size 22 pixel. So there is no space between 22 and px. So 22 and px, there should not be any px. So I show you the example in this one. I put, so here I put on the title 30 px, no space between your font size, the number, and the px. And we got this big, nice big letters. Font weight affects the boldness of text, assuming the font supports the specified weight. So not all fonts will support the weight. This value can be a keyword, example font weight bold, so just a keyword bold, or a number between 1 to 1000, so it can be 700, the equivalent of bold. Usually the numeric values will be in increments of 100 up to 900, so this will depend on the font. So different fonts will implement this in a different way. Let's try this in our example. So where we have put that font size, let me use a font weight of bold. Let me see how that looks. So this is default font. I have not used any special font. So so it becomes nicely bold, which is equivalent to 700, what was written over there. So let's write 700. It should look the same. Yeah, it looks same. What if I make this 900? So 900 is even more thicker than this. So it doesn't change a lot. 500. Do we have a 500? Yes, it comes back to that previous style. And if I have 100, so it doesn't have many, the system font doesn't have many options. So it is either the 100 or the 900. So there are two styles to this, which is like font weight, if I put simple bold and if I put normal. Text align will align text horizontally within an element, and you can use the common keyword you may have come across in word processors as the value of this property. Example, text align center. So let's try this on our page. On this one, so let's put a text align and center. Refresh, and so on both of this, on div and on this p, both of them will become text align center. We also have other values. We have right, and this will align to the right. Image height and width. Images aren't the only elements that we can adjust the height and width on, and we want to focus on them specifically in this case. By default, an image element's height and width value will be the same as the actual image's file height and width. If you wanted to adjust the size of the image without causing it to lose its proportions, you would use a value of auto for the height property and adjust the width value. So keep the width inside there and have the height as auto. For example, if an image's original size was 500 pixel height and 1000 pixel width, using the above CSS would result in a height of 250 px, because 500 px and 1000 px was the width. So if it is half, the width becomes half, the height will also adjust accordingly, keeping the aspect ratio. So let's try this in our example. So we need an image for this. Let's select a large wallpaper. So this is a big wallpaper, 2000 pixels wide. So let me take that image address and come to my code. So what I'm trying to do is put an image over here. Let's see the default, by default, what happens. So I put this free pick and I have put a huge image inside there, and it has put my long horizontal scroll. So this thing is has become a very big image. So one trick you can always have is image on image always have a max width, so it should not go beyond its parent, right? So if you want it to be within its parent, max width, I will apply this new property called max width. And if I refresh, so now there is no horizontal scroll and the image is contained within its parent. In this case, its parent is a body. It's directly in the body tag. We can create a div tag so that it's now inside a div tag, and div by its nature is block size. So there will be no change. It will be a div and it will be inside that div. So that is a nifty way to always ensure that your images don't overflow outside the parent tag or the body tag. And here we got that example of height auto. So now we will also maintain the aspect ratio. If you don't put it as auto and you tend to fix it with something, say for some screen, if you say 400 pixel, so that will skew the aspect ratio of the image. So you don't want that to happen. What you want to do, so that's why either you will fix the height and make the width as auto, or you will make the width, fix the width and then keep the height as auto. In this case, we will put a auto on our height and our image looks nice and the aspect ratio is maintained perfectly. It's best to include both of these properties for IMG elements, even if you don't plan on adjusting the values for the image file's original ones. When these values aren't included, if an image takes longer to load than the rest of the page contents, the image won't take up any space on the page at first, but will suddenly cause a drastic shift on the other page content once it does load in. So this is an important line. This is an important line I would want to remember. I am going to highlight this. When the values aren't included, the images won't take up any space, but suddenly cause a drastic shift on the page contents once it loads in. So this is something I want to remember for later. You might also want to bold this up. So this is the reason that the height and width, the pixels we have to fix in some applications, we have to fix just so that in the template, even when the image takes time to load, the template still has a placeholder for the image. Explicitly stating a height and width prevents this from happening, as space will be reserved on the page and will just appear as a blank space until the image loads, and there will not be looking at a drastic shift. Like in our example, we also saw that. So when we refreshed, so you saw initially, because this image was not there, if we change this to another different image, let's have another image. Now it's like a portrait size image. So let me copy that image address, and here on my image address, let me replace that. So notice now I've changed the image. Notice what happens. So when I copy, see there is a drastic change because initially the image was not there and then this image comes in. So that's why we have to be very careful on whether we want to fix this height and not get the template to be thrown off. So let's go back to our previous image, which was looking better in this flow, and that's how we want to look. Okay. Adding CSS to HTML. Now that we have learned some basic syntax, you might be wondering how to add all this CSS to our HTML. There are three methods to do so. So already I have been using one method. I have been putting it right in the HTML file. You have seen in the head tag. So I have a style tag and inside I was putting this. So there are three ways of adding CSS. So let's look at what are those. External style. External style is the most common method. You will come across it, and it involves creating a separate file for the CSS and linking it inside of an HTML's opening and closing head tags with a self-closing link element. So there is a link relation style sheet and then linking it to the style CSS. So let's do it after the title element. Let me put it in the styles. In my case, I have named it as style.css, and then let me take all the styles out of here and put it in my style.css. So this is in the same root. So index.html and style, they are in the same root. And I am taking out this style, which is no more required. So by doing this, first let's see what happens without the style. So when I've not included the styles, so then again everything breaks. There is no colors, no background, only the HTML, bare HTML is showing. So when I comment, so how I'm commenting this out is control and slash. So commenting in and commenting out is the same. It's a toggle. So now let me comment them back in. Now the style is again coming in. Now when I refresh, so all my colors and background and image size are again loading correctly. And in style.css, so in our case, we have the CSS selectors we have put already. First, we add a self-closing link element inside of the opening and closing head tags of the HTML file. The href attribute is the location of the CSS file, either an absolute URL or what you will be utilizing, a URL relative to the location of the HTML file. In our case, it is bang on in the root along with the index.html. In our example above, we are assuming both files are located in the same directory. So the same thing I have also followed. The rel attribute is required and it specifies the relationship between the HTML file and the linked file. So the rel, what kind of, you want to tell this browser, like what is the type of file this is, and we say rel equal to style sheet. So then even though it is set.css and most browsers will know this is a style sheet, it is an extra way of saying upfront that this is a style sheet that you are loading. Then inside the newly created style.css file, we have the selector followed by a pair of opening and closing curly braces, which called a declaration block. Finally, we place any declarations inside the declaration block, color white. So this is the property, this is the value. We have learned it up above. Is this put in one declaration with color being the property and white being the value, and background color black is another declaration. A note on file names, styles.css is just what we went with as the file name here. You can name the file whatever you want as long as the file type is .css. Though style or styles is most commonly used, so I have used style. A couple of pros to this method are, it keeps our HTML and CSS separated, so two types of code languages, HTML is in a different file, CSS in a different file, which results in the HTML file being smaller and making things look cleaner. Cleaner also means more maintainable. You want more maintainable code, which can be maintained for a long time without and create less bugs. We only need to edit the CSS in one place, which is especially handy for websites with many pages that all share similar styles. So currently we are just having one page, so it seems easier to just change it right inside the HTML file. But when you have thousands and maybe tens of thousands of pages in a big HTML site, then you would appreciate that what is the importance of external CSS file. Internal CSS. So when I started the example, I had everything as internal CSS. So everything was inside my HTML. I was mixing up HTML and CSS, but it was just for a learning purpose. So that's when you use the internal CSS file. So let's go through that. Internal CSS or embedded CSS involves adding the CSS within the HTML file itself instead of creating a completely separate file. With the internal method, you place all the rules inside of a pair of opening and closing style tags, which are then placed inside of the opening and closing head tags of your HTML file. Since the styles are being placed directly inside the head tags, we no longer need a link element that the external method requires. Besides these differences, the syntax is exactly the same as the external method: selector, curly braces, declaration. So you have a selector, you have curly braces, and then declarations as property and value. So the same thing with internal CSS. This method can be useful for adding unique styles to just a single page. So this will be specific to the HTML page. You will not get the styles on another page. So you have to be careful what you are adding in the inline CSS. Single page of a website, but it doesn't keep things separate like the external method. And depending on how many rules and declarations there are, it can cause the HTML file to get pretty big. So advanced websites will have a lot of rules on each of their elements, and this generally will make the HTML file grow very fast. The third style of adding CSS to HTML is known as inline CSS. Inline CSS makes it possible to add styles directly to HTML elements, though this method isn't as recommended. Body. So we have some HTML markup. The first thing to note, and in div style, we can see this is inline. So whatever till now we are putting outside in a style tag or external CSS, now they have come inline. So it is right on the element, and we have a style element and we have added it to that. The first thing to note is that we don't actually use any selectors here, since the styles are being added directly to the opening div tag itself. Only the opening div tag. The closing div tag, you can see, remains the same. So the closing div tag is remaining the same. Only on the opening div tag we have a style type attribute, and then we are adding the value to that attribute. Next, we have the style attribute with its value within the pair of quotation marks being the declarations. If you need to add a unique style for a single element, so previously internal CSS was for a single page. Now inline CSS is for a single element. This method can work just fine for a single element. Generally though, this isn't exactly a recommended way for adding CSS to HTML for a few reasons. Generally though, so this you want to remember. I will put this in bold because I want to remember this later. This isn't exactly a recommended way of adding CSS to HTML. And what are the reasons? It can quickly become pretty messy once you start adding a lot of declarations to a single element, causing your HTML file to become unnecessarily bloated. If you want many elements to have the same style, you would have to copy paste the same style to each individual element, causing lots of unnecessary repetition and more bloat. So repetition is bad in coding programming generally. So you have to find out ways how to avoid repetition. Any inline CSS will override with the other two methods, which can cause unexpected results. While we won't dive into it here, this can actually be taken advantage of. So this is how we also use inline CSS sometimes to override other styles, and it has to be used very sparingly. So this has to be used very sparingly as well, and not very generally. With that, we come to the assignments. So go to the exercise repository. This is in GitHub. This is the Odin project exercise repository. Read the README and only do the exercises in the Foundation directory in the order they are listed, starting with 01 CS method and ending with 05. So have fun working these assignments. So these are very easy given that you have gone through the lesson now. Knowledge check. What do we have in the knowledge check? What is the syntax for class and ID selectors? We have already gone through. How would you apply a single rule to two different selectors? Using adding a comma. Given an element that has an ID of title and a class of primary, so dot title hash primary. Sorry, it's the other way around. Hash title dot primary, and there is no space between the two. How would you use both attributes for a single rule? So that's how you have to. Don't use a space between the two. If you use a space between the two, then what it becomes? It becomes a parent-child construct. So you have a parent called ID title and a child called dot primary. What does the descendant combinator do? So it can select all the children, the descendants of, if you can properly add the selectors, it will select those children, the descendants. What are the names of 3 ways to add CSS to HTML? So there is external, internal, and inline. What are the main differences between the 3 ways of adding CSS to HTML? External for multiple pages, internal for a single page, and inline for a single element. Additional resources. So we have some additional resources. What are these? CSS values and unit. This is on MDN. Can be used to learn the various types of values possible in absolute or relative terms. So there are various values and units. You can go through those. And interactive scrim. So this is on Scrimba. So this is on Scrimba, which covers much of the material in the lesson in an interactive form. So you can go through the Scrimba and have the same, go through the same again, once have a rehash of what we learned in this lesson. So with that, we come to end of intro to CSS. So we come to the end of intro to CSS lecture, and that would be all for this one. So with this, we'll move on to the next one.